Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and you are watching a new episode on the Wojennik TV YouTube channel. Today I would like to show you a review of a game of one of my favorite designers and of one of my favorite companies. This will be a game published in 2018 by Legion Wargames, which is called Nemesis Burma 1944. The game was created by Kim Kanger, a Swede who was earlier the author of such hits as Tonkin or Ici c'est la France, the Algerian War of Independence, or Dien Bien Phu. So great titles from this author, and I'm always very closely looking at new games published by both Legion Wargames and designed by Kim Kanger. So Burma was a must-have for me. I had to check how this game works. The game will cover a very interesting topic of World War II, because as I said earlier, Kanger most often created games which were in some way connected to the history of France. Both Ici c'est la France or Dien Bien Phu were connected to the French colonies or overseas possessions that France had. Here we have a very different topic, because concentrating on the World War II and on the Burmese campaign fought from March to August 1944. During this campaign, the Japanese tried to launch an offensive towards India to take Impal and then to invade India, but this offensive was a disastrous defeat. Now, the game is supposed to be played by two players, but because we will have some very distinctive front lines and fronts in this game, it is possible also to play it with a group of 3 or even 4 players, because the map, as you will see in a few moments, is divided into separate fronts. We have first of all the center of the map, where the Japanese forces are controlling Burma, with some exceptions. On the west we have India and the major objectives of the Japanese campaign, which will be Impal and other cities, and to the east we will have the Chinese forces, which will try to stop or at sometimes also counterattack against the Japanese garrisons defending the Burmese frontier. To the north we will have the American-Chinese forces in the Stilwell force, and somewhere in the center we'll have also the Chindit units. So a very interesting strategical situation and a very interesting campaign. I always closely look at games which are covering not very often used topics in wargaming, because I like new topics, I like new games which try to represent such events. The game is also a special one, because it is a game in which Kanger tries to implement a new gaming system, which he called the open game system. In this system we will have a distinctive number of phases during each turn, but the order in which those phases will be played will depend on cheat draws. So we will know what phases will be played, we won't know in which order. This is something interesting, and I definitely wanted to try it. The game is for players aged 12 years old or higher, and the time of play is somewhere from 360 to even 600 minutes, so it is quite long to play. Now, during this video I would like to show you the game, how it looks, then I would like to briefly explain how it works, and at the end I will give you my final thoughts about this design and my final verdict concerning this title. So let's begin. At first, let's take a brief look at all the components of Nemesis Burma 1944. Now, the first major element on which the game will be played is the game map. As you can see, a very colorful one, a game map which represents a part of Burma, a part of India and a part of China. So this will be pretty much all the terrain on which the battle historically took place in 1944. As you can see, the terrain is very diverse. So we have some flat fragments of the battlefield, we have some terrain features, especially in the center, in the Burma sector. We have a lot of mountains to the west where the Japanese forces will be trying to breach the British defense and to take Impal, which will be the major Japanese objective in this game. On the eastern side of the map, we will have a struggle between the Japanese and Chinese forces led by Chiang Kai-shek. Here also a mountainous region with some additional rivers and with some additional roads, which will be crossing parts of the board. In general, roads will be very important. Roads, tracks or paths will allow units to move much more quickly than in open terrain. Furthermore, roads will be crucial in order to bring supply to units fighting somewhere in the front line. Now, this map, as you might have seen, is very diverse. We have a lot of terrain features, so we have some woods, we have some mountains, we have also a lot of small towns or cities. Now, what is important when it comes to such cities, such locations, they can have some information printed on them, and they will be first of all supply sources which will be indicated in circles, and also victory point areas which will grant your enemy points if he manages to take such a spot. Now, the allied objectives which will grant them points are printed in black on a beige background, whereas the Japanese goals, the Japanese objectives will be printed in a white, with a white font on a gray background. Each of them can be worth a different number of points. The most precious objective is Impala, as I said earlier, which is worth a whopping 20 points for the Japanese side. Now, each of the hexes on the board has its own number. Some of them also have a letter symbol indicating that there will be a unit placed on such a hex during the game's setup. As you can see, a lot of roads or tracks or paths, because in this game traveling through those connections will be part of the strategy, and some units will be able only to travel through those connections. So it is important to see how those connections look like, where we can take a shortcut by moving through a road, or where it is possible to block an advance of an enemy column or an enemy troop. This map also has some additional information printed on it. As in most Kim Kanger's games, we have some additional tracks. Here we have the Japanese Satisfaction and Lament track, on which 3 counters will be moved. For first of all, our generals counter, General Mutaguchi, secondly our Emperor's Hirohito counter, and thirdly our Lament marker, which will also be moved alongside this track. We have some boxes which will hold ambush markers, bunkers, the Japanese regiments, control markers. We have a track for phase counters. We have also some boxes to store Japanese battalions, Japanese losses, permanent losses, an additional box where we can store our aircraft support marker. We have also the turn track. As you can see, the game can last up to 10 turns from March 1944 to August 1944. As you can see, some of the turns are also indicated with a cloud and some rain, because the game ends in clear weather, but then we enter the monsoon period, and this monsoon, first of all a normal monsoon, then a heavy monsoon, will heavily influence gameplay and the capability of units to move and to fully use their potential. We have also additional tracks which will be used by the allied player, first of all to track his losses, his off-map units, his permanent losses, the chindit battalions, the phases which will be used by the player while drawing phase cheats. an additional track for his own counters. Here we have General Slim. We will be having also a Churchill counter, which will be counterpart of Hirohito, and the Lament marker as it was in the Japanese case. We have one additional track where two additional counters will be moved: the Resource marker and Chiang Kai-shek's marker, which will indicate the power of the Chinese army allied to the Americans and to the British. Now this marker is a special one because it is double-sided and you can freely choose which side to use. You can choose also Kim Kanger's counter in order to track this information concerning the Chinese forces. So this is also a landmark of Kim Kanger's games. He always tries to include himself. This was the case, for instance, in Ici c'est la France, where his counter was also present. Now, the last thing on the map which I would like to show you is the combat resolution table. This table is printed only on the map. You do not find it either on the player aids chart nor in the rulebook. It's up here. I will discuss it a little bit later. Apart from this gorgeous map, we receive, of course, a lot of counters, and those counters are of two types. The first ones will be markers or additional counters used to track some information, for instance, to track supply or the lack of supply, counters used to indicate the control of some objectives, additional counters which will be used on tracks such as the mentioned earlier Chiang Kai-shek counter or the general's counters. The second type are the units, and here we have two types of units. First of all, big-sized units, which will be the Japanese regiments or also the allied units. And those units have three different parameters, three different information. The first one will be the strength value, the big digit will be the movement value, and the small one in the circle will be the quality value. Now the big units are double-sided because they have also a reduced side, which, as you can see, has a reduced strength factor. The smaller units will be used as a replacement for the big counters when the big units take losses, or in the case you decide to split your unit into smaller ones. The Japanese have such a possibility. The Allied players cannot do this. They can only replace the big counters with smaller ones in the case of special units, which will be the chained units. Standard Allied units will have only two steps and they will be eliminated without the possibility to split and to place small-scale units. Now those small-scale units are, as you can see, battalions with the same three exact parameters. They are double-sided because the second side will show limited supply in order to avoid placing additional counters on the board. Now we have infantry units. We have also different types of units in the game. So we have artillery units, airborne units, tanks, engineers, cavalry. Those units can have also a yellow background, which will indicate support units. Support will be extremely important during combat because having support units enables you to receive support advantage, which will grant you an additional combat shift on the combat resolution table. Now, some units also have their mobility factor indicated in red, for instance, tank units. This will indicate that such unit is a motorized unit, and motorized unit will be moving only alongside roads, paths or tracks. So such units will not be able to move from a road. They will have to stick to the road system, which is pretty much reasonable because I can't imagine a tank being moved somewhere alongside a deep jungle. Now, Apart from the counters, we receive also 3 additional player aid charts. The first one will be the terrain effect chart, which will show you different types of terrain. As you can see, we have a lot of terrain which will enable us to move alongside roads, tracks or paths, but we have also some clear terrains, jungle, rough terrain, mountains, cliffs, major rivers, minor rivers. Each of them has a certain movement cost, which will be different during standard turns and during heavy monsoon, when, as you can see, the cost of crossing such hexes or entering such hexes will be doubled at most times. We have also some terrains which will have a special influence on movement or on combat. The second player aid chart will be the nationalities chart, which will show you the different types of units, with also an explanation of how to read the different information on such units. I didn't show it to you, but it deserves to be mentioned that we have also some special types of units. Those will be the transporters in 3 types: headquarters, trucks and mules, which all will be used to bring supply to units fighting on the map, because in this game supply will be king. It will be one of the most important, if not the most important thing. Logistics in Nemesis Burma is absolutely crucial. In order to bring supply to the fighting units, we will be using such counters, which all of them has a certain range, enabling to supply units being in such a range. So those units will be very, very important to both sides. The last player aid will be an additional document or an additional chart, which will be showing you the information about satisfaction points, about the lament marker, about monsoon and its influence on gameplay, because those information are being presented in the rulebook, but they are also presented on this chart in order to use it during gameplay. It's much more easy to see how the markers will be moved during game using this chart than each time opening the rulebook and checking those information. Now, when it comes to the rulebook is of a standard size and quality. When it comes to Legion Wargames, it's a colored rulebook on high quality paper with some examples, with information concerning the different playing pieces, with also the explanation of the major rules. Now, this rulebook had already been replaced by some living rules updated regularly by Kim Kanger, both on Consim World and on Board Game Geek. There were some questions concerning the rules, and Kim Kanger, as always, is very helpful. He responds to all those questions, and also at the same time he updates the living rules, which I strongly recommend you to read. They are not very much different from those rules enclosed in the game box. The living rules have some additional explanations, some additional things which were not major but small issues, and some question marks which could have been addressed better. So not a very important list of changes in those living rules, but it is always nice to see the most recent version of the rules when you play a game. Now, those are all the elements which we will be using playing Nemesis Burma. Now I would like to briefly explain how the game works, what are its basic mechanisms. A game of Burma 1944 can last up to 10 turns. Your objective in the game will be in general to satisfy your superior's expectations. So the most important thing determining victory will be the place of your superior's counter on the satisfaction track. In case one of the players manages to bring his superior's counter to the last 9th spot on this track, and at the same time he manages to reduce the place of his opponent's superior to 0, he immediately wins. So it is possible to end the game with sudden death. If this is not the case, the game ends after turn 10. We verify which player has his superior the farthest on this track, the closer to the last spot, and this player wins. In case of a tie, it's a draw. Now, how to move this marker, because we have several markers on this track. Now, this is a pretty much clever thing, because this marker will be moved both backwards and forward. It will be moving forward when your general counter will be moved to the end of this track and will reach the end and will restart its movement from the start of the track. Each time your general arrives to the end and is brought back to the beginning of this track, your superior is being also moved one place to the right. At the same time, if your lament marker reaches the end of the track, and if it is also placed to the beginning of this track, your superior will be moved one spot backwards. So those two markers, the lament marker and your general marker, will determine how your marker will be moved. But how those two markers are moved. Now, this is explained both in the rules as also on this player aid chart. And as you can see, satisfaction points, which will help to move your general's counter, will be added. For instance, each time you roll a modified die roll of 5 or more, or your opponent rolls a modified die roll of 2 or less on the combat results table. So this marker will be moved during certain die rolls during battle. Also, if you happen to take an objective. As I said earlier, each objective has a certain number of satisfaction points, is worth a certain number of satisfaction points, and this is how to move your general. The same thing applies if you also reoccupy a terrain which was occupied by your opponent. If you regain it, you can receive a certain number of satisfaction points. The lament marker will be moved each time in general when you take some losses. Each time one of your units is eliminated when it comes to the allied player, or reduced when it comes to the Japanese player, this lament marker will be moved alongside the track. You will also lose points each time you lose each time you use support. In the case when your opponent also has support, you will lose points during the attrition step. So there are many ways in which this counter can be moved alongside the track, and it is a good idea to place all those information on a separate player aids chart. In order to gain those points, you will have to move your units. You will have to launch assaults. You will have to launch attacks. At the same time, you will also have to look carefully at your supply, because as I said a few moments ago, in this game, supply is absolutely crucial. Now, how a game of Nemesis looks like. The game is being divided into turns, and during those turns, each player will play a set of 4 phases. But what is interesting and what is special when it comes to this game is the fact that the phases which will be played during each turn will not be in the same order. Each player has his own set of his phase cheats, and during each turn he will be drawing those cheats from a recipient. Now, during the first turn, both players start the game with their assault marker as their compulsory first phase. After playing the assault phase, they will be randomly drawing cheats. So the order in which those phases will be played during a turn can be different during each and every turn. When reaching your last phase, you will, at the end of the turn, bring back 3 of those counters back to the cup in order to draw them. One of those counters will be chosen by you as your first phase during the next turn, with one exception. You cannot choose the last cheat drawn during the current turn. So if you ended the turn with an attack phase, you cannot begin a new turn with an attack phase. You have to choose the reinforcements, the supply check, or the assault phase as your first one. The 3 other counters will be placed back in the cup and will be drawn after playing your first phase. So this is a clever mechanics because it is something which increases the replayability. It also increases the improbability or rather the uncertainty of how a turn will be developing during each and every turn. Now we have in this game 4 phases, as I said earlier. Each of them is very important, and I would like to describe very briefly how each of those phases works. The first one is the assault phase, which enables you first of all to fully move all of your units on the board and then to make 1 stack combats. What this means? Well, first of all, when choosing the assault cheat, you can move each and every of your units on the game map. At the same time, you have to also comply with the rules governing movement points, governing stacking, because there are some rules which tell you how much units can be placed on one hex. This depends on their size and on the terrain type on which you would like to stack units, on nationalities, because for instance Japanese can more easily create stacks than the Allies. Now, after moving those units, you can also declare attacks, but in the assault phase you can attack only 3 times and only from 1 hex at a time. So even if you have units surrounding a unit, you can launch an attack only from 1 chosen hex. You cannot combine units on different hexes. During an attack, we make the sum of the strength factors of each unit participating in combat, and we verify the odds ratio. Now, what is also interesting in this game is the combat resolution table, because as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns, but the odds will not be there will be some odds missing between those columns. So for instance, we have a 3-to-1 ratio and then a 5-to-1. We do not have a 4-to-1 ratio. So if you are 4-to-1, you will be using 3-to-1, the 3-to-1 column. At the same time, if you obtain a combat shift, for instance from 5, 1 combat shift will bring you instantly to 7-to-1, not to 6-to-1, because 6-to-1 is absent from this table. Now, during combat, you will be also taking into consideration support, which is being brought by aircraft or by yellow units, which have a support value. If you have at least 3 support more than your opponent, you can obtain a combat shift. Defense in mountains grants you also an additional combat shift when it comes to the defender. During combat, you can also declare special actions, massive combat if you have 8 or more steps participating in combat, which will augment the number of losses taken by both sides. The Japanese player can also activate a Banzai charge, which will grant him an additional die roll modifier, but at the same time it also brings his units directly to the permanent losses box instead of the losses box. Lost units can be replaced, brought back. Permanently lost units cannot. So this is a thing worth using a few times during the game, but it is also risky. Now, the combat can end with step losses, but also with retreats. Unlike many games, retreats are not just automatic. In order to make a unit retreat, you have to force such a retreat, which again will also require you to choose a leading unit. As in the combat itself, the leading unit can even take some step losses during attacks if it is of a smaller quality, if its quality is lesser than the defenders. If such a retreat is being forced, the defender can choose to hold ground, but if he chooses, he will have to lose some steps. Now, quality is very important in Nemesis Burma because it influences a few things. It gives you additional column shifts during combat, because if we have, for instance, a unit with a quality 3 attacking a unit with a quality 1, we get 2 combat shifts. So this is a huge advantage if we are having units of a better quality. Secondly, units with a higher quality have a larger zone of control. Now, unlike in most games, zone of control will only influence one thing in this game. It will prohibit units from using operational stretch movement next to such in the proximity of such units. You do not have to stop in a unit proximity if this unit's quality is inferior to yours. So a unit with a quality of 1 will not exert zone of control to all the surrounding units. Such a zone of control will be exerted by a unit of quality 3, of a 3 quality. So it is absolutely possible to move next to a unit with an inferior quality. It's very, very important, and it is also unorthodox, because in most games all units have the same zone of control, which is being exerted to all the 6 hexes around your unit. Now, after your combats, you take a new cheat from the pool, and the second cheat which can be obtained is the attack cheat. Now, the attack cheat works pretty much like the assault cheat, with one but very important difference. You can move only 1 hex and only 1 hex. At the same time, the number of movement points that you can use during this movement is being equal to your quality. So again, quality is a thing which influences your mobility and your possibility to act. After moving your units up to 1 hex, you can launch 3 attacks. This time you can combine attacks from different hexes, so you can choose, for instance, to attack a unit or a stack of units from 2, 3, 4 hexes which are around this hex. The third type of phase which can be played is the reinforcements phase. During the reinforcements phase, we will be placing units which enter the game as reinforcements, but they do not instantly enter the map. They are being placed, when it comes to the allied player, on the allied off-map box. In order to place them on the map board, we will have to spend resource points. Now, those resources will be added each time your opponent takes objectives, and also at the end of the turn. So if the Japanese manages to score a lot of points, this resource counter will be moved forward pretty much very quicker than if the Japanese offensive stalled. As you can see, many units are being placed on this box, but in order to bring them to play, you will have to spend resources, which is not always possible. Apart from placing reinforcements, you can also bring replacements. So it is possible to bring your weakened units, for instance, to a full step unit if you have such replacement steps. The number of replacements is also depends also on the turn. It's much more easy to replace units during the first initial turns than during heavy monsoon. The last phase is the supply check, which is a crucial one, because at this point you have to check for the supply of each and every of your units on the map board. And a unit can be in 3 different states: in full supply, in limited supply, or out of supply. Its status will influence its possibility to launch attacks, to move, and it will also influence the possibility of taking step losses due to lack of supply. Now, tracing supply is a complicated thing, because you have to track supply from a supply source, and then, thanks to your transporters, back to your units. In order to do this, we verify if a unit is being connected to a supply source. If it is not, you will have to trace supply to one of the transporters, which, as I said earlier, can be a mule, a truck, or a headquarter. It is also possible to make a chain of supply, so from a supply source you can bring supply to your headquarters counter, and from the headquarters counter to a mule, which brings supply to the front unit. Tracing supply requires you to count a certain number of hexes and paying movement points to enter such a hex from the supplying unit. So a unit which is not supplied will be out of supply, and it will be very limited when it comes to its combat capabilities. The Allies have the luxury of supplying some units through the earth, because they have air supply markers which can be placed on the western side of the map. So they can bring supply to cut-off units, also using this air bridge. Now, after playing all the phases, which can be played in a different order during each turn, a game turn ends. We verify if a player has achieved victory, we add additional resources for the allied player, and we begin a new turn. At the end of the 10th turn, we verify if one of the players has his superior more satisfied than his opponent. Now, there are a lot of additional rules governing, for instance, ambushes, bunkers, which are also governing advance after combat, which are also governing, for instance, Japanese river supply depots or attrition, but I won't be explaining them right now. Rather, I would like to tell you what are my thoughts about this game, what I think are its strong and a little bit weaker points. At the beginning of this video, I have already said that Legion Wargames and Kim Kanger are one of my favorite designing companies and designers. So I was very anxious to try Nemesis Burma 1944 and to see if these high expectations concerning this title were met. And I would like to give you my opinion about this game during this conclusion. Now, first of all, what I think is a really strong point of this game is its topic, is its subject. Burma is a very interesting theater of World War II, which is not very well known, which was not also the subject of a lot of war games. So it is always nice to discover a game, to play a game which covers such an event, such a theater of World War II or of another conflict, which had not been up until now simulated in a board game in a lot of titles. So I really like to play such games. The second thing which deserves to be mentioned is the high quality of the components that you receive. The map is just gorgeous. It's very pretty. At the same time, it's absolutely very functional. And at the same time, it's also a very interesting map, which means that during gameplay, before the game starts even, you will have to carefully look at all that is on this map. The strategical situation is very interesting. You have very distinctive fronts: the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the Northern Front, sometimes the Central Front if the Chindits are being engaged by the Japanese. At the same time, you always have to carefully look at all the roads, paths, railroads which are on the map. Why? Well, because those will be the paths through which you will try to move your units in order to launch offensive strikes. You will also have to very carefully plan how to bring supply to your frontline units. And to do this, you will have to very carefully use this network of roads, paths, trails. In most games set in Europe, the connections are pretty obvious, are pretty straightforward. You have a road which connects from one city to another. Here, those paths or those trails or those tracks will very often make some circles, conturn peaks, summits, because the eastern and the western parts will be very mountainous. So not always the most obvious path will be the one to take. Sometimes you will have to conturn enemy defenses, sometimes you will try to cut the enemy lines through a path or track that he didn't expect you to do so. So very interesting situation, very interesting map, and I like such maps because those maps are things that increase your planning. You have to very carefully study this map in order to make most of the strategical situation. What I really like in this game is also the way in which the real campaign, which took place in 1944, had been simulated. You have a lot of things, a lot of mechanics, which are here just to represent the way that the events went in 1944. So the key role of supply is not here because Kim Kanger decided it would be a good idea just to include this in the game. It is because it was really one of the major reasons of the Japanese defeat in 1944. The Japanese offensive was launched without sufficient supply. They brought a lot of cattle with them in the hope to eat those cattle, to eat this cattle, use it, and then to occupy Allied depots and acquire supply in such a way. In fact, it didn't happen, and the offensive stalled very quickly, and the problems due to the lack of supply, to starvation, were such high that most casualties, Japanese casualties during this campaign, were due to starvation and lack of supply. So supply is here with a good reason. Another thing is the way that the quality of the units had been represented. We have high quality Japanese units compared to very low quality Chinese units, and sometimes mediocre or high quality British units. This initially gives an edge to the Japanese, who launch their offensive, who manage at most times to break through the British line or to pound the Chinese if you decide to attack on the east. And this happens during the initial turns. But then Allied reinforcements begin to enter the map. Japanese supply becomes overstretched. You have to also make sure that you correctly count your offensive before the monsoon begins. So a lot of things are happening, and this game really nicely represents how the real offensive went, because the Japanese broke through the British line, and then the offensive stalled before an Allied counterattack. So here you will also find those mechanics, and you will find this game dynamic, which will in some way simulate the way that the campaign 1944 looked like. What I really like are the small things which increase the chrome in this game. So you have the banzai attacks, you have the massive attacks, you have the aircraft, which at most times will help the allies because they had more aircraft in this region. They have the possibility to supply units through air. You have the Japanese ports on the other hand, the river ports, which can supply units alongside rivers. You have a very interesting mechanic which will differentiate the way that the turns will be played, because you will have this open game system included in the game. This is a nice idea. It's not a very innovative approach because it already happened in some games, but it is really a thing that I was a little bit skeptical at the beginning, because I was wondering if this mechanic will suit such a game. But then after playing a few turns, I realized that this is another factor which in a good way simulates the way that the campaign went, because all the belligerents had to cope with the very difficult, very complex strategical situation during this campaign. Very often they tried to do what was the best in their current situation. So they not always attacked when they wanted, when they planned. They attacked when they thought they had the best odds. They tried to reinforce units when they received such reinforcements. They tried to bring supply in a constant way. But at some times they had to launch an attack in the hope of taking some allied supplies, some opposing supplies. So this system really nicely suits the strategical situation. I think this was a very good idea to implement it in Burma 1944. What I like is also the fact that the belligerents are very asymmetrical. Now you might say in most war games the fighting sides are asymmetrical. It's just a thing which is a normal thing for war games. But here those differences between the fighting sides are really, really big. The Japanese forces have regiments. They can split those regiments into battalions. They have also the possibility to launch banzai attacks. They have the possibility to place ambush tokens, to create more bunkers, to use river supply, etc. The Allies, on the other hand, have more aircraft. They have the Chindit units. They have the possibility to make air supply, or even to transport some units through the airlift, through the air bridge using the airlift action. They have very different forces both in the British Army and the Chinese Army and in the Chinese American forces of Stilwell. So those forces will be very different, and the two sides will be playing a very different battle using very different forces. I like it a lot. So what, in my opinion, are the weaker points of this game? I would say that this game is a game which is quite difficult to learn. It is a game with a lot of details, with a lot of nuances. As in most Kim Kanger's games, we have additional tracks with counters which will be moved back or moved forward depending on the situation, on certain things that happen on the game map. You will have a lot of details governing supply, movement. The combat structure will also be very precise, very detailed. So there will be a lot of things that you will be checking through the game. Even in the mid of your first game, you will still not be very comfortable with those mechanisms, and you will try to look in the rulebook to see if you had not omitted anything. So at the same time, this influences also the time of play. I said at the beginning of this video that you should end a game in from about 360 to 600 minutes. If you are playing your first game, it will be closer to 600 minutes. The sole exception will be if the Japanese win through sudden death, because the Allies have, well, a slim chance of winning through sudden death. At the beginning of the game, the Japanese are on the offensive. They can smash through the British, and if lucky, score a lot of points and increase the satisfaction of their emperor. But the Allies, well, they lack the resources to launch an immediate, very strong attack at the beginning of this game. So most Allied wins will happen at the end of the 10th turn, when they already managed to counterattack and to push back the Japanese, taking some of their objectives. So the game will be quite long. It will be very dynamic, it will be very intense, but it will be quite long. What deserves to be mentioned is the replay value, because I had not said anything about it. You have only one scenario, but in my opinion this game has a huge replay value. This is due to the fact that the initial strategical situation is such a complex one that you can imagine different openings. You can concentrate on the British while playing with the Japanese. You can concentrate on the Chinese. You can try to smash through the Stilwell force. So you have a lot of different options. The Allies, on the other hand, well, they will be reacting during the first turns. But then you also have a lot of decisions to take. You will have to carefully plan your counterattack and to focus on some sectors. So the replay value will be quite high. Although, as I said earlier, the time of play can be a thing that will be a problem for some people. I can't imagine playing this game during one evening session, because the game will take from even 5 to 6 hours, which is even longer, which is really long. This is a game which you should play during reunions, during conventions, or maybe even through Vassal. If you have a lot of time and you can save the game and then replay it on the second day or in a week with your friend, it's absolutely feasible. It's absolutely a thing you can do. But if you want to play this game during one evening, this will be a hard thing to achieve. Concluding, Nemesis Burma 1944 is another high quality, very interesting game, both from Kim Kanger and Legion Wargames. It is covering a very interesting topic of World War II. It is full of chrome, it is full of interesting mechanics, which are here not without a reason to simulate the way that the campaign went, but at the same time enabling you to make tons of decisions, interesting decisions, a game with huge replay value, with a nice dynamic, with interesting mechanics. You should definitely try it, especially if you like this period of World War II and games covering the struggle of the Allies against the Japanese Empire. This was a review of Nemesis Burma 1944 from Legion Wargames. Thank you a lot for watching this video, and I wish you a fantastic day and see you next time.